Welcome back to the Marvel Movie Minute, a daily podcast in which we explore the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe 1 minute at a time. In this, our fourth season, we're looking at Kenneth Branagh's 2011 film, Thor. I'm Matthew Fox from theethicalpanda.com.
And I'm Andy Nelson from thenextreel.com.
And today is our final hiatus episode, leading into season 4 of the Marvel Movie Minute. And really, this is kind of our introduction, our prelude. This is the time for Andy and I just kind of take a moment and talk about what we're going to be doing this season. And kind of, it's we're chatting for 15 minutes before we hit play on the movie. So I'm really looking forward to this. And Andy, let's kind of just get started. I think we have a lot of loyal listeners who've been back season after season. I think, though, we're definitely going to be, hopefully we're getting some new people, some growth, folks who are super excited for Thor. What is the Marvel Movie Minute? How would you explain that to folks who are kind of new? They don't really know what this is about. They want to hear Thor content, but what are we going to be doing for the next 112 episodes?
Yeah, right. Well, this is what's so fun about these Movies by Minutes podcasts is that it gives you an opportunity to really explore and dig deep in a very passionate way all of the details of a particular film. In this particular case, we're breaking down the MCU 1 minute at a time, and it gives us a chance to look in great depth at what's going on within each of the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and to talk about not just what's happening in the film, but kind of how the production happened to get us to that point, what was going on in the comics that kind of are influencing the way things are being shaped in the film, all of that sort of stuff. So it's just a chance to kind of dig even that much deeper into kind of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is something that all of us here who are tuning in really love.
I think that's such a great way to explain it. And I'll be honest, my first connection to this program was you all asked me to be a guest on Iron Man the first time.
Yeah, right.
And when, this, it's nice to be reached out to and asked to be on a podcast. But when you told me the idea was to talk about an individual minute of Iron Man, I thought you were nuts. I had no idea what we'd get into. And I was so impressed with what we did there and the way, and I've really enjoyed listening to all of these, that when you asked me to talk about this movie, I was super excited, especially about Thor, because, it's funny. I think a lot of people think of these movies, myself included to some extent, and I'll get into this when we get into Thor especially, they're popcorn flicks. They're fun movies to watch in the theaters and eat some popcorn and have a fun escape for 2 hours, but that's about it. And I feel especially looking back on these movies, knowing now the whole huge MCU they've grown into, and knowing that these the tiny detail from Iron Man plays out in an Avengers movie 12 years later, or the tiny detail from this movie becomes relevant in Loki however many years later. I'm bad at math. I think kind of knowing all we know now about the MCU, really going deep and seeing what were people like Kenneth Branagh, all the different layers and layers they thought of. It just to me makes it so exciting to go into this kind of level of analysis about a movie.
It is. It's a lot of fun. I like doing this anyway, just really kind of exploring the production and what the story's doing and how they position the cameras. And there's so much interesting stuff happening. And we're certainly by far not the first people to do this, nor will we be the last. This was this movie by minute format was popularized by the Star Wars Minute folks, and they run a fantastic podcast, and there are a lot of other movies by minutes out there. But I just I don't know. There's something about looking at the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the fact that it was spawned by these comics that all they kind of overlap. And when Kevin Feige came up with this idea of kind of creating a cinematic universe, which, that term wasn't around until Kevin Feige, and they really came up with this idea of creating a cinematic universe, of having these films that kind of are individual in and of themselves, but can lead to potential crossover films like we saw with the sixth film, The Avengers, and how it's kind of continued. It allows for a lot of fun exploration and just to see how all of this unfolds.
I think that's such a great point. And it's funny how much this has changed literally movie making and TV making and on-screen entertainment in general entirely. It's hard to imagine that this is true, but yeah, you're right. The term cinematic universe, TV universe, these didn't really exist before. You had maybe when Law and Order would do a crossover with Chicago SVU or whatever it was. Like, that was mind blowing, even though it was a 10-second thing. And I remember, like, I was super excited to see the Michael Keaton Batman movie. I'd watched Batman 66 with Adam West. I never thought they would be connected. So,
sure.
Yeah, I think there's so much we can get into. And we'll talk about what we're excited, specifically the movie, but let's kind of do our own introductions. Andy, for those who are tuning in, or I know you weren't on the last one, maybe haven't heard from you a lot, what's kind of your connection to this and sort of how you got connected to the podcasting, especially to where you come in as a Marvel fan?
Well, I mean, I been podcasting about movies since 2011 with The Next Reel. Pete and I started up that show, and it just allows us to talk about, at the time it was called Movies We Like, and we were talking about movies that we liked. And eventually we started expanding because we wanted to explore other types of movies, and so we changed the name to The Next Reel. And so I love the format of podcasting. I think that it allows for such interesting and personal kind of connection and exploration with any particular topic. So I don't know. After listening to stuff like the Star Wars Minute, I was thinking about it. I'm like, God, it would be really fun to do the MCU films. I mean, I came into it. I read comics as a kid. I was one of those kids who I had a hard time connecting with a lot of the major comics because I always felt like I was coming in on the middle of stories. And but because these stories, they span years and years. And so what I would do is I would either buy like a kind of the graphic novel collection of a number of particular stories and kind of read them that way. Or I was always looking for like the special, 4-issue limited series types of things. And so I have like a Rocket Raccoon 4-issue limited series back from the 80s when nobody knew who he was. And I was collecting a lot of strange things. And also I was young. I was collecting a lot of more child oriented things. Like I was collecting all the Droids comics and things like that. So I really enjoyed comics, but I had a very specific kind of focus. It wasn't until I got older that I started exploring a lot more. Spider-Man was really the first one that I really started digging into.
Yeah.
And just, I loved the Spider-Man comics. And then, I dabbled in a lot of the other Marvel ones, but I never really got into reading them until after the movies started really coming out. And even then, I wasn't reading them that much. It was more, as I started this show, I was like, this is going to be a good opportunity to actually go back and read these stories. And so when I did Iron Man, I went back and I read hundreds and hundreds of issues of Iron Man just to get a sense of the character and the history, and reading about his alcoholism and all the darkness in the story. I'm like, there is so much interesting stuff going on in this particular character. I just was just completely taken by what they did. And like Incredible Hulk, I didn't end up, as you know, didn't do that show. Kyle and Rob did an incredible job, if I may say, of doing that show. But at the same time, I was using it as an opportunity to read, I read everything with the Abomination and all of those stories. So
that's
I've
awesome.
found this show as a great opportunity to really kind of continue expanding my love and kind of the scope of my understanding of the characters as they are both in the comics and then also in the films, just because I really enjoy the stories. I mean, I'm a film lover. I love all types of films, Martin Scorsese included. And I love all of it, but I also really love the Marvel films. I have so much fun watching them.
I totally hear that. I am a huge MCU fan. I need to confess right off the bat, and this is sort of my unfortunate history, but I promise listeners that I have become a convert. I'm the definition of a dirty casual. I knew almost nothing about these characters. I didn't read many comic books as a kid or a young adult, or even now. I know these characters primarily from what I see on screen, and part of that's because kind of what you talked about, have trouble getting into it. Part of it is my brain is just not very visual, so I've always had trouble with the visual format. And part of it's because the stories all seemed a little silly to me. And again, because I think that was my impression, the 80s was like the friends of mine who were into comic books as a kid were really into comic books, and just it never seemed to really appeal to me. And similarly with a lot of comic book movies, I was a DC guy. I'd grown up with Superman. I loved Batman. Spider-Man was kind of cool, but I knew nothing about these characters. But then I saw a couple of the MCU movies and I started to really get hooked. And somewhere along the way, I got really into this idea of superheroes and superpowers being this fantastic way to explore, the things that happen in our own world, whether it's like family connections or ethical questions or hard dilemmas or whatever it is. But just say, okay, but what happens if they have these powers? What happens to the world if they have powers? And that's really what hooked me. And I have 2 podcasts I do now. They're both under that name, The Ethical Panda. One's called Superhero Ethics, where we kind of go into those kind of deeper superhero, like, ethical questions. And the other's Star Wars Universe podcast. And it's kind of funny, kind of like what you were saying. It started because I wanted to discuss these things more. My best buddy and I were realizing we were talking about these questions all the time. And both of our partners maybe encouraged us that maybe finding an outlet that wasn't talking to them about our super in-depth theories was not the worst thing in the world. And we realized we're spending so much time talking about this all day anyway. Let's, we're egotistical fellows. We're egotistical folks. Of course, other people are going to want to listen to our thoughts. So, and I've been amazed by how much it has taken off, especially in how much this becomes a conversation. And it's something why I'm so excited to be asked by you all to be a part of this project, because it gives me a chance to kind of not only be a part of a different kind of a podcast, but to, I know, taking part in the Discord, which I know we're going to talk about, and communicating with the members. The conversation is just so rich. And for me, more than anything, I don't want podcasts to just be a conversation between the two of us. I like it when it kind of really can just, branch out and get more voices involved and stuff like that. So, yeah, so I kind of have a bumpy road of coming to this, but I'm super excited that I've, like Paul in Damascus, I'm the scales have fallen from my eyes. I've discovered the glory of Thor and Marvel and all this. And I'm, as someone who I'm reading some of the comic books, but still struggling with them, I'm really looking forward to the fact that you've done so much of that research, and a lot of our guests have done so much of that research, because I'm really looking forward, especially to learning, like, how does this Thor compare to the Thor from the comic books or the Thor from mythology and all that kind of stuff?
Well, that's something that I'm going to be curious about too, because I think, I've been reading a lot of Thor comics. It's funny, I never had read a Thor comic ever. That is one of the areas I have never touched. And so it is all new for me jumping into Thor right now, which has been fun, reading these comics and kind of exploring the world with, the whole Donald Blake element and just the way that world moves. But I think that you might be coming in because you've been doing a lot more of the research and reading on the Norse mythology side of things.
I think we're going to have 2 great perspectives there. We've kind of well divided up the research, as well as we have all these different guests who we're bringing on who are experts in everything from, Shakespeare and how this movie plays into Shakespearean stuff, to we have a person who's an expert on stage hair and makeup and things like that, who I know has very strong feelings about Chris Hemsworth's wig. So it's really going to get to, the kind of things that, like, you wouldn't think about, but, spending 10 minutes talking about the wig and how that worked and stuff like that, or I think there's something about they bleached his facial hair that did not work very well.
Oh, yeah. I can't wait to talk more about that.
As well as just that, that this is the groundwork for so much of the rest of the universe that I think it's just going to be great to dig into. And so let's kind of use that as a segue. So let's talk about Thor himself and the movie itself, the character. What did you know about this character? Like, when you heard there was a Thor movie being made, what was your first thought? How, did you go to see the movie? Were you excited about it? Were you sort of not hooked? What was kind of your appealing?
At that point, I had I missed Incredible Hulk in the theaters, but I had started seeing the rest of them. Like, when I realized, they're doing this whole Marvel Cinematic Universe thing, I guess I'll go to these. And so I went and saw Thor in the theater. I don't remember. This was that point when a lot of movies are being converted to 3D. I can't remember if I saw it in 3D. It's entirely possible I did, because I was, a 3D fan, and so I would check that out. But so I would go and see it, and I probably, if memory serves, I remember enjoying the film. I didn't know much about Thor at that particular moment, but I was like, okay, this is fun. I like that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is expanding the way they are. We started with a couple Earthbound scientist superheroes, and now we're moving into kind of the outer spacey, more crazy sorts of fantasy sorts of things. I thought they established that fairly well, and so by the time we got to Thor, I was like, I bought into it. I totally went along for the ride, so I had a great time with it.
And that's awesome. And I think that's where, again, we're going to have different perspectives that I really appreciate because, again, dirty casual moment here. I didn't see the movie when it came out. I was kind of getting started in my career after grad school. I had a lot going on. But I think I'd loved Iron Man and I'd loved like the Chris Nolan Batman movies. But I still was in that place of, oh, that's a comic book movie. That's not something I'm going to enjoy. And this big sort of super muscular guy, it just didn't grab me. And then I saw the Avengers movie, and I thought, this is a fascinating character. And I watched the dynamic between him and Loki, and I was like, I want to know what's happening there. And so I kind of had that already in mind when I went back and watched it. And I think even the first time I watched it, I still kind of like, I watched it in the theater. I wasn't going for an in-depth view of it. And I thought it was fine. It didn't really grab me as much. But it was when I got to see so much more of the character in the later movies and see all those seeds that were planted that I got to go back and on the second or third time I watched it, really realized like there's so much more to this movie than I thought there was. And especially then when you invited me to be a part of this project, I remember thinking like, I think there's a lot there, but I'm kind of curious. And then when I started listening to like Kenneth Branagh talk about all his thoughts about the movie, it felt like I was getting to pull back the curtain and see a whole other part of the movie that I hadn't seen before. Which is, and I guess kind of that gives my answer to the second question. So I'll turn that back to you. So what did you think when you saw the movie?
I mean, I enjoyed it. And it's interesting because I think my question at the time was, but when I knew the movie was coming out before I had seen it was like, okay, Thor is a Norse god. How are they going to make that work in context of this story that has been fairly realistic up to this point? Are all of a sudden we're going to have like a realm of gods? Like that seems like a strange direction to take. So I was really curious about that. And I actually really enjoyed the way that they dealt with that, how it's like, it's another realm. They're essentially kind of just another race, I guess you could say. And as they say in the film, their science is just more advanced than ours. So it appears like magic. And I was like, okay, that's actually a really interesting way to describe it. So when they came down here, they seemed like gods. They're not really gods. They're just more of a super being, but they are another being. They're not like the idea of a god. So I liked the way that they dealt with that. I bought into that explanation for the story. And I thought it was actually a strong way to make that work. The whole idea of a Norse god as a superhero. I was like, okay, I totally buy into it. It works for me. So I ended up saying to myself, I think that these people know what they're doing as far as how they're building this universe.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it because that was certainly one reason why I loved Iron Man so much and why I loved the Chris Nolan Batman movies so much. They didn't feel like comic book movies to me. They felt like, Dark Knight is still one of my, forgive me, I'm quoting, I'm supporting DC on a Marvel podcast, but I tend to...
that's a great movie. That's fine.
Ecumenical in my love, yeah. To me, Dark Knight is a movie about city law enforcement professionals trying to figure out how to deal with corruption while someone is coming along to, blow open the doors of everything that they think about what is right or wrong. And one of the people who happens to be fighting crime is wearing a cape, but it felt like in the same way, Iron Man, like you said, it felt like the powers were ridiculous, but you didn't have, if you sort of said like, okay, what if science could do just like 5% more than it could, or maybe 50%? I'm not a scientist, but it didn't feel completely otherworldly. It didn't feel like the impression that I'd gotten from comic books that, like I said, by now I have realized this was not accurate, but that I had now, it didn't feel like the kind of, well, check all your assumptions at the door, nothing matters, nothing's real, no character development, etc. And I think you're right. I think for me, Thor felt the most like, okay, now this is gods. Now we're going back into space. But the movie does so much to ground it in the real world. And especially with having so much of it be the fish out of water story is one I always love in terms of Thor having to deal with life without his powers. And as well as, and it's something we'll talk about, I think, a lot during the show, and I know I've heard Branagh talk about this a lot, once I realized that at the heart of this movie, it wasn't about capes, it wasn't about beautiful hair and pectorals, although he's a beautiful man, no argument there. It wasn't about the powers, it was about two sons figuring out if their father loved them and trusted them, and realizing the rivalry that their father has kind of engendered between the two of them. And when I was able to see it that way and be able to see like, wait, this is an incredibly human story. This is a story that I've never carried a big hammer, but I have a sibling, I have a parent, I have things we can relate to here. I think that really hooked me, so much more when I kind of understood, like, that's really what's going on in this movie.
There's a lot of that. I think that your reaction there is one of the ones that makes especially Thor so interesting, because, I mean, really look at it. Thor is the film that established the character Loki that has been with us since. And that is a very rare occurrence in Marvel films, to have a villain that kind of continues to last that long. They usually get killed or get locked up. And
right.
Yeah, we might see Michael Keaton pop up at some point again, who knows? But it's very rare to have a villain continue as long as Loki has. And I think that is a really interesting element that's going to be fun to explore in this film. And so and the way that they've kind of created it. And also just talking about the changes they've made, like instead of having Jane Foster be a nurse, have her be a scientist. I think that's a great step forward that really did also help find a way to ground it in Earth and the Earth science that we're kind of using as our foundation on that side of the story.
I think that's very true. And it also allows me to name kind of what I think was one of my other prejudices I brought into the movie, which was, as a hardcore Star Wars fan, I did not have the fondest memories of Natalie Portman's acting when I went into seeing this movie for the first time. And I think we're going to get into it a lot. I think sometimes the chemistry between her and Chris Hemsworth is not as good as maybe it could have been, or couples in some other movies. But I think she gives a much more nuanced and much better performance than I ever saw. And to me, also, like, realizing, like, Darcy is a character who we really have just kind of rediscovered now with WandaVision. She gets her start here. And getting to see, like, all these little characters who just pop up for 5-10 seconds, or like small parts in the movie, and how they planted the seeds for what becomes. I mean, I think Asgard is probably, after Earth, the planet we've spent by far the most time on in the MCU in general. Am I right on that, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, well, considering we really haven't spent that much time on other than like the Guardians of the Galaxy films, yeah, I mean, Asgard certainly is the one that we've been to the most.
Right. Yeah. We've gone to Titan a little bit. We've gone to some other, a particular movie might go to a planet, but it's the only one that's really become a regular part of the MCU.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. In those cases, it's usually like we go to a place for a scene to happen, and then they go to a different place for a different scene. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think you're most excited to explore? Not kind of one thing, but what are some of the because I think one of the things we're going to do is we're not just going to do, here's everything what happens in a minute. I've been kind of describing this podcast to a lot of my friends is, the tangent minute, in that we're going to take, like, we're going to try and each minute, like, go over the things that happen that minute, but there might be 5 seconds of a shot or a line that just sends us off into 10 minutes of discussing, like, what the director meant, or the acting, or the how that ties into Norse mythology or something like that. So I think so, and we're going to be very open to see what our guests want to take us to and things like that. But as we've been working a lot to kind of come up with some ideas of what we want to talk about. What do you think are the things you're most excited that we're going to explore this season?
I love the filmmaking side of it, and kind of the process they go into, like coming up with how they're creating all of these different elements, the locations, the way that they settle on how each of the characters are going to look. I find all of that stuff so interesting, and then the way it ends up getting constructed, and the deleted scenes. Like, why did they cut a particular scene? Why did they, did they ever even shoot this thing that happened to be in the script? Like, those are those elements that I find so interesting to explore. But kind of as I was alluding to earlier, one of the things I'm most excited to explore is kind of like, where are those comic book connections? Like, I've been reading a lot of the Thor comics and finding those little seeds that have been dropped in various stories over the decades, and going, oh, that's interesting. So that's how the Frost Giants looked when they were first created. And this is where they get to by the time the film is out. Like, how did they take that journey? Like, there's so many little things like that I really look forward to digging into.
And here's why I think we're going to be so well matched. Forgive me for bragging on our own podcast, but because those are things I am not at all connected to the movie making business at all. And so those are a lot of stuff that goes way over my head. And even just kind of hearing you discuss it already, or when we discussed it on Iron Man, I feel like I learned so much. So I hope our listeners will. I think I'm really going to learn a lot from that. And I think the comic book knowledge could be so interesting because, again, I've been studying, but also I have a long history with the Norse gods, both in terms of studying the mythology, but also the modern day practices. In another very different part of my life, I have a theological background and very interfaith background, and I've spent some time studying and working with the neo-pagan communities, and some of which are, they often refer to themselves as asatru or heathen, but the people who, for them, these stories are not ancient myths. They are the, religious stories that they find meaning in, the way others would find meaning in, whatever their religious texts are. And I remember being at a party, actually, many years ago. I think it was when I was still in grad school or coming to the end of grad, or soon after. And we just heard that the movie Thor had been announced, that was going to be made. And I was talking to one person who was a hardcore comics person and another person who was a very strong, religious devotee of Thor. And they were arguing about which one of them was going to be more offended if this movie got it wrong. Which was just this, hilarious moment, but also kind of just this great illustration of where the character of Thor sits, in terms of, first of all, we're going to get into this a little bit, even just the question of, did Stan Lee or Jack Kirby create Thor? There's a lot of kind of drama about that that'll be fun to dive into. But realizing, they're basing it on stories that are 1,200 years old and that have been mythologized and held there. So I think that's going to be great, great stuff to explore and to kind of see what does it mean to have a character kind of balanced in those two.
Right. There's a lot of interesting fodder that I think we're going to find in all of these different elements that we'll be able to talk about. So I have a feeling we will have bountiful conversation, and I'm excited that we're going to have a lot of interesting guests to talk with. I can't wait to kind of explore just all of the different aspects of the story with all of these people. It's going to be a fun season. I
think one thing I'm particularly excited about on my ethics podcast, we often get into the topic of villains because, heroes can be kind of boring. Villains are the interesting ones, I think, sometimes. Not always, but, moral grayness is interesting to me. And it's one thing for a person to just be a mustache twirler and wahaha, I want to conquer the world. I love the character who thinks they're justified. I love the character who thinks they are the hero. And I feel like Loki is absolutely in the top triumph. If there's a Mount Rushmore of villains who think they're heroes and who've had a journey over the course, by the TV show Loki, he is straight up a hero. To me, I'm so excited to really be able to dive into that because obviously, spoiler warning, so much of this movie revolves around Loki doing villainous things. Yeah. But in a way that the movie manages to make us feel very sympathetic towards him in a way that sort of by the end of it, I am, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun hearing your perspective and others' perspectives. I feel very morally torn about Loki, just in this movie and especially knowing where he goes later. And so I'm really excited to kind of dive more into that because I think that there's just so much richness in terms of the terrible things Loki does, but also living in the shadow of Thor, who's, if I had to choose an older sibling, not my first choice. The way that Odin, his father, kind of treats him and lies to him about his childhood. I think there's so much just family drama there that I'm just really excited for us to dive into. That's going to be a lot of fun, kind of that Shakespearean heightened story aspect of it. So yeah, I completely hear you there. It's going to be fun. Definitely. Any other kind of last things you're excited about or particular guests you want to kind of give a sneak preview of that you're looking forward to? Yeah, it would be hard to pick because I think we have so many interesting guests with such a variety of backgrounds, whether it's filmmaking backgrounds or kind of storytelling backgrounds, Norse mythological backgrounds, Shakespeare. I feel like there's a lot of opportunity for us to have exciting conversations with all of them. And so I'm just excited to start digging in and kind of see what we come up with as far as this movie goes. Definitely. Well, I'm excited. You're excited. Hopefully some of our listeners are excited. And I know the listeners can always just be listeners. You're certainly welcome to do that. But one way to kind of really directly plug in is through membership. And Andy, I know you've kind of been changing around the membership model a little bit for this particular season. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about that? Yeah, it is changing slightly. We're going to get it all locked in, and you'll be able to find out on the website kind of all the specifics of it. But in addition to the monthly support, we're now going to be providing an opportunity to support annually. You can get a discount, actually, if you sign up to support by paying for a year at a time. We love delivering content to our listeners that is free of the ads that you don't want to have to hear.
we also love producing this show for you, but it does take time and money. And so that's just something that we do is create these memberships. And if you want to become an Asgardian champion and help us out by becoming a member for this season, we'd appreciate it. Membership is $5 a month, or you get the discount, as I said, and you get bonus content, early access to the shows. We're going to be live streaming all the shows, and so you'll have access to the live streams, stickers, more. There will be all sorts of stuff. You can learn more at truestory.fm/Marvel Movie Minute. Just click on the button that says membership.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a really exciting thing you all are doing in terms of, everyone can listen to this, but for people who, this whole podcast is about diving deeper. So if you want to dive deeper with us as we dive deeper, membership is going to be a great way to do that. So
that's a lot of diving.
Yeah, exactly. We just watched the Olympics. We got inspired by that.
That's right.
Andy, any other kind of last comments you want to make?
No, I think that's it. So let's head on out of here, and we can catch up with everybody over in episode 1.
Sounds good. Well, please remember that Marvel Movie Minute is a production of True Story FM. It's engineering by Andy Nelson. The show's music is One Last Ride by Martin. I really hope by the end of this season I learn how to pronounce this. Puringer. Find the show at truestory.fm. If your podcast app allows ratings and reviews, please consider doing that for the show. It's a great way to help other people join the conversation, to help other people find it, and just make this a bigger conversation, and we all win from that. So thank you all so much. Andy, thank you again for having a part of this, and thanks to all our fans for your support. Have a good day.
Until next time, true believers.
Marvel Movie Minute is a production of True Story FM, engineering by Andy Nelson. This season's music is One Last Ride by Martin Puringer. Find the show at truestory.fm, and if your podcast app allows ratings and reviews, consider doing that for this show.